So I just finished the previous video is about the apology. Socrates is defending his way of life to the Athenians. The majority, unfortunately, voted him guilty and then voted him to die. And so I'm writing a paper on the Crito. This is what happens while Socrates is in prison. The dialogue takes place 2 nights before Socrates is going to die. His old friend and benefactor, Crito, a wealthy businessman, has bribed the guard and is coming to get Socrates out. Socrates refuses to go. The dialogue depicts a conversation between Crito and Socrates about whether he should flee. Arguments are presented on both sides. In the end, Socrates wins out and Crito leaves without him. Is this a historical document? No, but it's the kind of thing Crito would have said and the kind of response Socrates would have given him. The argument begins with Crito making his case for Socrates' escape. First, I will be deprived of a friend, the like of whom I shall never find again. Second, many people who do not know you or me very well will think that I could have saved you if I were willing to spend money, but that I did not care to do so. Surely there can be no worse reputation than to be thought to value money more highly than one's friends. Third, even if your friend should be compelled to lose all our property or pay heavy fines and suffer other punishment, we accept the risk. Fourth, it won't cost Crito much money to free Socrates, both because the informers and guards are cheaply bribed, and because other philosophers, including Simmias and Cebes, have contributed to the fund. Fifth, quote, if you left Athens, you would be welcomed in any places to which you might go, unquote, so do not hesitate on that account. Sixth, if you give up your life, you're agreeing, quote, to hasten your fate as your enemies would hasten it, and indeed have hastened it. Seventh, quote, you are betraying your sons by going away and leaving them when you could bring them up and educate them. You thus show no concern for what their fate may be, unquote. Eighth, the situation will be thought to have got beyond our control through some cowardice and unmanliness on our part, since we did not save you or you save yourself when it was possible and could be done if we had been of the slightest use. Step by step, Socrates tries to lead Crito out of the cave, where opinion is the only reality. Quote, we should not think so much of what the majority will say about us, but what he will say who understands justice and injustice. You were wrong to believe that we should care for the opinion of the many. Socrates tries to lead Crito toward the light through a process of self-examination and reflection. Quote, we must examine whether we should act in this way or not, as not only now but at all times I am the kind of person who listens only to the argument that on reflection seems best to me, unquote. Socrates next posits 2 principles. First, one must never in any way do wrong willingly. This is an old principle, remember? Even Plato does not curse the Athenians. He tries to educate them. In Socrates' case, it would have been wrong for him to stop his questioning of authority figures. He felt compelled by a divine calling to try and keep the city's authorities accountable for their uses of power. Second, quote, nor must one, when wronged, inflict wrong in return. Further, when one has come to an agreement that is just with someone, one should fulfill it. Unquote. When Socrates applies these principles to his particular case, he concludes, quote, if we leave the prison without the city's permission, we are injuring people who we should least injure, unquote. We are breaking a just agreement. These principles are true because the most important thing is not life, but the good life, unquote. And in order to live the good life, we shall not harm and corrupt that part of ourselves that is improved by just actions and destroyed by unjust actions, unquote. Acting unjustly is always evil. Retaliating evil for evil is unjust. There is a part of ourselves, our minds, nous, which recognizes the truth of these principles. Because he thinks these principles are true, Socrates cannot escape. Socrates is aware, however, that, quote, only a few people hold this view or will hold it, and there's no common ground between those who hold this view and those who do not, but they inevitably despise each other's views, unquote. He asks Crito whether he should escape based on this view. Crito reluctantly answers, I do not know. Okay, it's important here that Socrates is using his mind, because in the next dialogue, the Phaedo, he says, everything I did in my life was governed by my mind. Socrates' life, as presented by Plato, is driven by the insights of his mind, his nous, insights he believes any human being can grasp. The first insight is, quote, no one does wrong willingly, unquote. Based partially on this principle, Socrates felt compelled to go to the marketplace, to private homes, or anywhere people were meeting and discussing public affairs. He questioned the authorities because he felt compelled to demand that as social and political leaders rule for the sake of those over whom they are ruling, and that they base their decisions on the values of justice and wisdom. When his interrogations exposed authorities as greedy and power-hungry, exercising their authority for personal ends instead of for the good of society, Socrates criticizes them. In some cases, he questions religious authorities. For this, he was accused of being an atheist. Young men from the aristocratic class followed him and listened to the conversations with the authorities. They became disillusioned about the competence of their elders they had formerly trusted. For this, Socrates was accused of corrupting the youth. But Socrates believed that to ignore the corruption, to remain apathetic, would have been wrong, and he would, quote, not do wrong willingly, unquote. So he persisted. If there really was a law against not believing in the city's gods, then Socrates did feel compelled to break that law. If there was no law, he might have been violating a cultural norm, which condemns anyone who does not read the religious text literally or agree with the interpretations of the religious authorities. But those who quoted from the holy books, but the religious authorities quoted from the holy books to do unjust deeds were really the ones who did not believe in the gods. They made themselves into gods, allowing their own self-interested judgment to subvert the moral lessons the religious books were intended to teach. So Socrates was engaged in non-violent civil disobedience, either against this law or against the dominant social norm of not believing in the city's gods. Similarly, if there really was a law against corrupting the youth, then Socrates also felt compelled to break that law. Again, it might have been just a cultural norm that adults did not air their disagreements in front of the youth because they wanted the youth to trust their judgment and obey their authority. But it was the elders who truly lacked respect for authority when they abused it to gain wealth, fame, and more power, rather than using it for the good of those over whom they ruled. Again, Socrates either engaged in nonviolent civil disobedience against this law, or he acted against the social norm by allowing the youth to question authority. But he felt compelled to do so, because he would have been doing wrong willingly if he had failed to expose the corruption around him. Socrates' activities in both cases are the greatest gift to any city which has freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, freedom of association, offices held by election or by lottery, and trial by jury. Such a system requires a continual public questioning by the citizens of those in authority to assure that power is being exercised for the sake of the ruled and that the authorities have the knowledge to rule well. Authorities need both the desire and the competence to rule, and citizens have a duty to make their authorities render an account of what they are doing and why. If authorities must give an account of their actions, they will more likely be guided by reason. If members of society understood their duties as rulers and as conscientious citizens the way Socrates does, there would be less disorder in the city. When religious leaders are made accountable for what they think the gods demand, the city becomes more stable. When young people are taught that they must develop some expertise and grow up to exercise their authority for the sake of those over whom they rule, the city will be more stable. Unfortunately, Socrates was perceived as a threat, not a gift to Athens. He knew he might be taken to court unjustly for his activities, and that he would refuse banishment, so he knew he might be killed by running away. But Crito did not understand. The key issue in this part of the Crito is whether Socrates' agreement with the laws is indeed a just agreement. If some laws in an overall system of individual freedom and the rule of law are unjust, can a person break them and run from the punishment? Or if the laws in this kind of system are applied unjustly, must a just person accept the decisions of the courts? Crito believes it is permissible to break laws that are not just or are not applied justly. In defense of the laws, Socrates says, "Do you think it possible for a city not to be destroyed if the verdicts of its courts have no force, but are nullified and set at naught by private individuals?" Unquote. In response to the question just asked, Socrates asked Crito, quote, "Shall we say in answer, the city wronged me and its decision was not right?" Unquote. Crito emphatically agrees with this response. "Yes, by Zeus, Socrates, that's our answer." Unquote. Socrates' argument on behalf of the laws responds to Crito's position here. The belief that one can pick and choose which laws and which decisions of the courts to obey in a system of a rule of law, trial by jury, and due process. As a citizen of Athens, Socrates has made an agreement to abide by the decisions made by the legal system. When the voice of the laws presents a series of arguments, it's clear that Socrates is living under a political system which allows a great deal of freedom for its citizens and which is based on the rule of law, trial by jury, and due process. The voice of the laws makes a number of claims. First, the laws claim, "We have given you birth, nurtured you, and educated you. We have given you and all other citizens a share of all the good things we could." Second, Athenian citizens are free to move to a colony if they want to. Third, Socrates had a chance to persuade his accusers that he was not guilty. Quote, "One must obey the commands of one's city and country or persuade it as to the nature of justice." Unquote. If citizens fail to persuade their accusers, however, they must abide by the verdicts of the court, because a city, quote, "is destroyed if the verdicts of its courts have no force but are nullified by private individuals." Unquote. Socrates himself has raised a family in Athens and has spent almost all his long life there. The human mind recognizes intuitively that we are social and political creatures, dependent on laws and institutions to survive. Anyone interested in living well, not just in surviving, depends even more on social stability and well-run institutions. Living well requires not only the stability and efficiency of those laws and institutions focused on survival, such as food production, housing, clothing, and law enforcement, but also well-conceived laws and well-run institutions which allow education, religion, culture, and the arts and sciences to flourish. Certainly, Socrates is aware that unjust laws exist, and even just laws can be applied or enforced unjustly. But in a free and open society where citizens are given a voice in politics, they must work within the legal framework through persuasion. They must try to get legislators to change unjust laws, to create new laws, or to convince those who apply and enforce the laws to do so justly. When these attempts fail, a citizen cannot ignore or break the laws. The irony of Socrates' situation is that the laws which exist to preserve him and his family by creating and maintaining social order are now being enforced in a way which will destroy his life and undermine the social order. At the end of the Apology, Socrates addresses the jurors who voted against him. Socrates knows the Athenians are mistaken, both by considering him an atheist and a corrupter of youth, and by believing their decision will lead to greater social order. Quote, "You did this in the belief that you would avoid giving an account of your life, but I maintain that quite the opposite will happen to you. There will be more people to test you. They will be more difficult to deal with," unquote. But the fact that the Athenians are making a great mistake by condemning Socrates does not give Socrates license to reject what he believes to be true. We should never do wrong willingly. We should not injure anyone. We should not retaliate when injured, and we should not break just agreements. The issue here is the nature of the agreement between citizens and laws in societies based on individual freedom and the rule of law, and whether that agreement should be called just even when it leads to injustice. This agreement is Socrates' reason for accepting the punishment. It is also what Crito is most against or most confused about. The laws then present a series of consequences-based arguments about what in fact would happen if Socrates tried to escape. These are the arguments which ultimately convince Crito. First, Socrates' friends will suffer. Okay, so for Plato, it's just we are social and political creatures by nature. We need law. That's why we have to accept even unjust punishments, but we have to keep working to make sure our laws are good and applied well and enforced well. And that's why he was constantly engaged in that dialogue, which would cultivate practical wisdom in the citizens so they would prevent the kind of disaster that happened. And then for Crito, however, he doesn't understand that. He gives consequences-based arguments. First, Socrates' friends will suffer if he tries to escape. They will be driven into exile and lose their property. Second, contrary to Crito's claims, Socrates will have nowhere to go if he wants to finish raising and educating his children. He will deprive them of Athenian citizenship, making them homeless. If he and his family escape to a well-run city, they will be discovered, condemned, and deported. If they escape to a poorly run city, they might not be exiled, but his children will be raised in a disorderly society without a proper education. As long as they are in exile from the law, wherever they go, many disgraceful things will be said about Socrates to his children, and they won't ever be able to get a decent education or to have a decent position in society. On the other hand, if Socrates accepts his punishment, at least his friends can raise his children in Athens as citizens and can tell them why their father died. The arguments presented by the laws are based on fear and survival instinct and on consequences, not on the insights of the mind. Incidentally, this is still true. I mean, every parent is in exactly the same situation all the time, where there's nowhere to run. So, one reason to think the arguments presented by the laws do not convince Socrates is that they could have been used against him throughout his life as reasons not to engage in the process of self-examination and the examination of others, which he considered a divine calling. He knew he had been putting his friends and family in some danger by choosing the kind of life he led. He knew his friends and family were socially stigmatized by his behavior, but that was not a sufficient reason to quit. He believed he was defending the true spirit of Athenian law by questioning those who abused it. Socrates is not critical of the legal system of Athens in principle. Again, as I've always said, he admired what the founders or the previous generations had passed down to them, the system. The citizens who applied the laws, not the laws themselves, were what was corrupt and unjust. Although Socrates has been wronged by men, not by the laws, if he tries to escape, he will undermine the laws. The laws advise Socrates, quote, "Do not value either your children or your life or anything else more than goodness, in order that when you arrive in Hades, You may have all this as your defense before the rulers there. Crito is finally subdued, but only by the consequentialist arguments of the laws. Crito says, I have nothing more to say, Socrates. Unquote. Even though Crito finally accepts Socrates' death, he and Socrates have fundamentally different attitudes toward life and the rule of law. Socrates accepts the fact that people need laws in order to survive, that laws in a free and open society, based on the rule of law, not the will of an arbitrary and absolute leader, can be unjust or applied unjustly, and that even corruptions of the laws must be accepted in order to prevent social chaos. For these very reasons, Socrates spends his life examining and re-examining himself and others, working to make his society more just and its citizens more virtuous. Crito's attitude is very different. So it's the caveman and the one who lives in the light of reason. As long as Crito thinks a citizen should abide by the laws when he's benefited by them, but is free to ignore or break the laws when he thinks he or his friends are unjustly accused, Crito will not be motivated to admonish the Athenians to pursue virtue and to examine and re-examine their legal system. As long as he thinks that his money and power will enable him to protect himself and his family and friends, he will not work to prevent corruption. He does not even view his own behavior as corrupt. By the end of the dialogue, Crito seems able to recognize that citizens should not break the law for their personal benefit if social chaos would result, because then everyone would suffer. But this is not an argument based on an insight of the mind. If Crito could convince himself that some illegal activity would not lead to chaos, he would be just as likely to act illegally. His motivation for accepting Socrates' death is based not on mind, but on a calculation of the consequences in his particular case. The fact that Crito has nothing more to say does not mean he has been persuaded. He simply cannot refute Socrates. And if you remember, Plato's dialogues would not be allowed in. They would be censored in any authoritarian society. So these arguments are only meaningful arguments in a society that has enough free speech and freedom of education to have people able to read these books. So he's just arguing with people in societies that promote and allow for human flourishing, telling them the attitude they have to have about their system. The Crito and Kaufman's criteria for tragedy. First, the dialogue clearly reflects Kaufman's criterion, humankind's radical insecurity. Within Socrates' lifetime, Athens fell from a flourishing democracy into social chaos, the election of a dictator, and then the condemnation of Socrates, the greatest friend to a democratic society. The dialogue depicts this decline. From what it shows about pervasive Athenian disrespect for the laws, the citizens must long since have developed a self-serving understanding of democratic freedom without enough respect for law and order. Selfish exploitation of the system undermined public authority so that only a dictator could forcibly restore an inferior kind of social order. At the time the dialogue is set, 399 BCE, the Athenians had reinstated democratic institutions, but were willing to include censorship and even banishment and death for certain kinds of public speech. The dialogue reflects Kaufman's human blindness in a number of ways. Crito is clearly blind to who he is and to the reality of the situation, for Socrates, for himself, for his friends, and for the Athenians. Crito's arguments for Socrates' escape apply as much to a mafia don as to Socrates. If Crito's best friend were guilty of murdering another murderer, for example, Crito could give him the same list of arguments. I don't want to lose my friends. Your friends are willing to take the risk. You can raise your children elsewhere, etc. Crito assumes Socrates is just and unjustly accused, but his reasons for escape do not distinguish Socrates from any other accused criminals. Rather, his reasons all follow from the first one: I would lose a friend. The principle here is my friend, right or wrong, which easily develops into my country, right or wrong, my family, right or wrong. It is tribalism, the protection of one's own. And if you have enough money or power, you can make good on that belief. Tribalism is always a difficult issue because societies cannot exist without people forming close ties with family and friends. It's natural to love your family and friends, and you're really strange if you don't. Friendships are the glue which holds societies together, as Aristotle points out in the Nicomachean Ethics. Quote, friendship seems to hold states together, and lawgivers apparently devote more attention to it than to justice. For concord, which means goodwill between people, seems to be something similar to friendship, and concord or goodwill is what they most strive to attain. Friendship is noble as well as necessary. We praise those who love their friends and consider the possession of many friends a noble thing. And further, we believe of our friends that they are good people. And as I said in one of the videos, Socrates really valued friends and friendships. Unquote. But because people are confused about the nature of the good, they're also confused about whether their friends are truly good. So friendship is important, but when people are wicked, blind, or ignorant, friendships can lead people to break the laws and undermine social order. Although Crito believes it's obvious that his friend is good and has been treated unjustly, his argument does not stand. Most people are blind to the purpose of law and the necessity of the rule of law to preserve social order. They privilege loyalty to kin over respect for law, which leads to greater instability. The dialogue further shows that tribalism has replaced the rule of law as the modus operandi in Athens. Crito is not the only one who manipulates the system for his own purposes. The guards are easily bribed. According to Crito, many Athenians expect Socrates to escape and will criticize Crito if he does not obey the law of the tribe and get his friend out. Crito will be publicly shamed if he does not get Socrates out. He will be thought of as not powerful enough or as not willing to spend his money. Whatever happened to the rule of law? Even foreign philosophers, Simmias and Cebes, do not hesitate to break those laws that go against their own notions of justice and injustice and threaten their friend. Crito is far from the only person guilty of human blindness. The blindness caused by friendship and goodwill, blindness to the fundamental importance of the rule of law to maintain social order, is a conflict experienced by those who consider themselves philosophical and those who do not, young and old, rich and poor. Further, Crito is upset that Socrates' choice to stay and accept the punishment will lead to the same end his enemies desire, his death. Crito does not believe that the reasons underlying the death of Socrates have any value or meaning. He is focused exclusively on the execution itself. But if you remember all the way through Tragedy, Aristotle, it's not just the choice, it's if it's done for the right reason, in the right way. So you can't tell from just your eyeballs looking at an event if it's actually just or unjust or good or evil or anything. But in Socrates' mind, the reasons he chooses to stay and accept the punishment are all important, fundamentally different. The choice to stay, the fundamental nature of it, is the reason why, if it's driven by a mind or by some other ulterior motive. He stays because his idea of the good and his application of this idea to the current situation demand that he stay. He does not stay because he agrees with his accusers. Crito's exclusive focus on consequences and his blindness to the principles at stake show he has given up on the life of the mind as a valuable motive for human behavior. But when the life of the mind and the personal lives of citizens is reduced to calculating self-interest only, the city becomes blind to the necessary foundations for its own existence and well-being. The loss of order in the soul will lead inevitably to chaos in the city. It is the Athenians, not Socrates, who disrespect the laws and undermine social order. Ironically, while Crito thinks he's doing Socrates a favor by helping him escape, thereby solving the problem, Crito's tribalism, his disrespect for the laws, his failure to act in accordance with his mind, and his exclusive focus on consequences, on getting the results he wants, with no concern for the good or evil at stake, are the very errors creating the kind of social climate which led to Socrates' accusation and condemnation. When a society is relatively stable, it is more tolerant of so-called free thinkers and social critics like Socrates. When a society becomes unstable, it becomes less tolerant. Hence Crito, as well as Socrates' other so-called friends, have helped create and sustain the problem rather than solve it, but they are blind to that fact. Kaufmann's third criterion is the curse of honesty. Socrates responds to Crito by being completely honest about what he believes. Quote, "We must examine whether we should act in this way or not, as not only now but at all times I am the kind of person who listens only to on the argument that on reflection seems best to me." Unquote. The kind of honesty Socrates demonstrates throughout the middle section of the dialogue, when he's explaining what reason demands, which is his idea of the good grasped by his nous, and how it applies to deliberation about an action in this case, is exactly the kind of honesty and the attitude of self-examination and the examination of others that leads to tragedy. Socrates says that the majority, because they are blind, quote, will inevitably despise, unquote, anyone who believes it is always wrong to do injustice or injury, even in retaliation against an injustice done to you. If the masses despise Socrates' views, and Socrates knows it, then he is constantly aware of the radical insecurity of his own life. He knows he can be unjustly accused at any time, and he knows he won't try to escape. This curse of honesty leads Kaufmann to say, quote, "While less outstanding men and women tend to shun the extremes of suffering, the noblest have a special affinity for the greatest suffering." Unquote. Crito thinks he, his friends, and Socrates have suffered enough. Socrates disagrees. The desire, again, the same old theme of the Achaeans, this desire not to suffer. I'm not going to suffer. And so then you commit hubris. You commit an extreme. And also Crito, when he says, I don't want my enemies to get their way, it's that desire for power, that wanting to get your digs, wanting to be number one. Okay, of course, anyway. This leads to Kaufmann's fourth criteria, the inevitability of tragedy. Socrates cannot please everyone. At this point, he seems to have pleased no one. If he does not speak out against the corruption of the Athenians, democracy will collapse. If he does speak out, he will be blamed for the social instability which arises from lack of self-control and respect for the rule of law. In the private sphere, the dominance of self-interest over concern for the well-being of the city leads to a need for more laws. In the public sphere, the overall disrespect for law has made Athens less stable. The use of the legal system to promote individual interests leads to the creation of unjust laws and the unjust enforcement of just laws. Socrates' public questioning of authority figures makes him appear to be the cause of the instability. Socrates is aware of the many layers of tragedy that result when people give up on a belief in justice and truth and a desire to find it, to seek wisdom. This does not make him ambivalent about what to do, it just makes him very aware of the precariousness of his situation and his way of life. Also, Socrates is aware of the conflict between his duty to his children and his duty to speak out against corruption. It is clear at the end of the Apology dialogue that Socrates wants his friends to raise his children according to their father's principles. Quote, "When my sons grow up, avenge yourselves by causing them the same kind of grief that I caused you. If you think they care for money or anything else more than they care for virtue, or if they think they are somebody when they are nobody, reproach them as I reproach you, that they do not care for the right things, and think they are worthy when they are not worthy of anything. If you do this, I shall have been justly treated by you, and my sons also." Given the opinions of friends like Crito, Socrates is understandably concerned about whether his children will be raised to love wisdom. The situation is tragic because Socrates cannot meet what he considers a divinely given command to examine himself and others without also putting his life in peril. By putting his life in peril, he risks not being able to live long enough to raise his children. He also knows it is not likely that his friends will raise them with the same values he has. But this does not cause him to be ambivalent about what to do with his life. He is simply aware of his tragic situation. Every reader who has a family can identify with Socrates on this point. Whenever people believe their societies are going astray, whenever they want publicly to criticize their countries, they're faced with a conflict between the demands of their families for attention and stability and social respect, and the demands of reason and personal integrity to tell the truth as they see it. Finally, Kaufman's fifth criteria clearly applies here. Quote, "Punishments that to the righteously indignant seem to be unquestionably just are often anything but that. Socrates' accusers, Meletus and Anytus, were self-righteous and indignant when they took Socrates to court for not believing in the city's gods and corrupting the youth. When the majority of the jury voted to put Socrates to death, the Athenians demonstrated that they could not distinguish between a philosopher and a sophist. Socrates was a great benefit to Athenian society because he questioned authorities and forced them to render an account of what they were doing. Sophists, by contrast, undermine authority to further their own political and economic agendas. The education Socrates gives his sons implies that he knows well-intentioned people often fail to distinguish between the honest person who makes sure authority figures are held accountable for their actions and the charlatan or opportunist who profits from social disintegration. Crito clearly qualifies as a sophist on this view because he uses the social and political system to get what he wants. Conclusion. The Crito dialogue, therefore, is a tragedy at many levels. Crito is a tragic figure because he thinks he's doing his friend a favor when actually his attitude toward the laws of Athens helped to set up Socrates' trial and death in the first place. He's blind to who he is. He just wants to save his friend. Socrates is a tragic figure because he knows too much. He's too honest with himself and others and is despised for that reason. He knows he cannot reciprocate Crito's friendship. He knows he cannot follow his divine call without being despised by many. He knows his calling might lead to his inability to finish raising his children, and might lead them to be inadequately educated. The men on the jury who voted to condemn Socrates are tragic figures because they had misguided notions of justice and injustice. They were blind, unable to distinguish between those who were undermining their society, such as the Sophists and Crito, and the one person who could help them. They killed the messenger. The situation in Athens during Socrates' lifetime was tragic because the Athenians during the Golden Age thought they were invincible. Within a very short time, they were forced to recognize their delusions. The rise and fall of Athenian democracy demonstrates the radical insecurity of the human condition. But still they didn't recognize their delusions. Still they wanted to find someone to blame, and they blamed Socrates. Even though the human condition includes a great deal of tragedy, however, the dialogue also implies that there is some way out, some ray of hope. By reading and discussing dialogues such as this, readers can begin to understand the ways their beliefs and behaviors promote or undermine social order. They can learn to listen to the voice of reason. This will lead to less insecurity, to the prevention of the most egregious human errors. The reader can learn what Crito could not, that we must pull ourselves out of the cave and toward the light of reason as the guide for human life. As long as education is possible, there's always hope that rational insight will rule the soul and that rational souls will rule the city. So also, Plato, this was part of his education for the youth of Athens and of all over Greece, so that they could learn the lessons and avoid unnecessary suffering and unnecessary tragedy. They can't avoid everything, but they can avoid something, and they can avoid a lot. If they want to avoid vulnerability or any kind of suffering, they're in trouble, and they'll probably do the wrong thing. I have a few minutes here, and so I thought I would just show how this applies very vividly in my own case or in the case of things. Today is Martin Luther King Jr. Day, and I just went to the movie Selma. And of course, Martin Luther King was one example of nonviolent civil disobedience. In his case, he knew the laws and the customs of the South violated the laws, the federal laws, and so he demonstrated. He knew that his life was in danger. He knew that his children, their lives might be in danger, but even more that he would die before they would grow up. He would not be able to educate them. He knew that he had nowhere to run. He couldn't go to some other country. He just had to demonstrate that he thought our society was hypocritical. Of course, we claim to accept equality, but we don't. The laws might say it, but the spirit of the people. So it's the spirit of the people that's corrupt, not necessarily the laws. But he had to accept the punishment. He accepted going to jail, not because he thought he was unjust, but because he didn't want to undermine law as such. He understood people are social and political beings by nature, and they need laws. And America was not a dictatorship. At the federal level, the laws were just, and so they just had to be enforced. So the other thing about that is he's a classic case of somebody who's in this kind of situation. Somebody could have come to the prison when he was there and say, I can help you escape, get out of the country, get your family out. But where would he go? It's the same problem. He would be discovered in any ordered society, and then there would be all this political stuff. Or he'd go to some remote island, Papua New Guinea or something, but his children would not have a life there. And then also my father marched in Selma, and that was one of my childhood memories. I was in 6th grade, And so I saw the movie, and I saw the bloody mark. I still wasn't ever quite clear about what came first and second, but there was the first day they tried to march to across the Pettus Bridge, and there was a big slaughter, a lot of people hurt and some killed. And then 2 days later was the ministers' march. There was this call for people. My father was that was what he went on. He was a minister, and he went on the ministers' march. And Martin Luther King, they did step back. The troops opened up for them to cross, but King prayed and then he went back. So they didn't test it because he was worried that there would be retaliation. Um, and that night, there's a scene where one of the ministers was going to dinner with another one, and they got beaten, and one of them died. Well, um, my father knew the guy who got killed, and actually, the guy who got killed had invited my father to go to dinner with them. And as a child, I remember all of that. My mother was kind of freaked out, and I had a dream about that where someone with a gun pointed it from one person to another. So, and then after he got home, people would call us up and swear on the phone. And my father let me know that there was as much racism in the North as in the South. And now I teach in the South. I teach in a place a lot, well, our rural Arkansas is, I think, spiritually a little closer to Alabama than it was to Minnesota, but it's hard to know. It's hard to know. Minnesotans can cover it up a lot better. Um, but anyway, so I know people were saying to my father, you shouldn't do this, you have little kids. You should take care of your kids, just put up and shut up. My father gave me the book by Bonhoeffer, Letters and Papers from Prison, when I was in, I think, 5th or 6th grade. And then he took me to the African Americans churches. We lived in St. Cloud, Lake Wobegon, and it was all white. But the African Americans in the Twin Cities wanted my dad to come and talk, and he took me because I was kind of the serious kid, the one that would be interested. And so they had these services where they're just, Alleluia, brother, and all this stuff. And I was this little uptight Swede. And so I remember all of that. And I remember thinking, no, it's right for my dad to be doing that. I think somebody I must have gotten ear to that argument. And I said, no, I'm proud of my dad, for doing that. And my best friend when I was in 9th grade said to me, well, your dad is almost a communist, And I didn't know what she was talking about. And my mother taught art history, and so she went down to a Methodist school in Holly Springs, Mississippi called Rust College in 2 different summers. And she taught summer school. She taught art history, which is, a white European discipline if there ever was one, especially at that time. But the idea was you could help them get accredited because here's a teacher with a master's degree. But also, in the evening when she wasn't teaching, she was registering people to vote. So I remember that when my mother left, I had to do the ironing and some of the cooking and all that. And I remember thinking, oh, I'm a big girl now, and I'm totally into this. And then when I was 16 and I was celebrating my 16th birthday, my birthday was actually on April 3rd, but we were celebrating it on Friday, and everybody knows what's coming. We were celebrating it. We were having cake and ice cream, and somebody called up and said, "Turn on the TV. Martin Luther King's been shot." And my father cried, and everybody cried, and I remember right then. I think I was in 10th grade or 9th grade, and in between that, 6th grade, going to see the churches, and halfway through 9th grade, 10th grade, 1968, in between there, I had been a very superficial, classic adolescent girl. I mean, petty and totally into boys and clothes and all that. And I just decided that day I'm going to be a serious person. I'm going to find out what's going on in the world, and I'm going to start caring about that. So, and I was marching in anti war demonstrations and civil rights and the nuclear freeze movement, and I mean, you name it, because I do believe. And I was in Indonesia a couple years ago, and I told the kids, I told them, you've got to organize every once in a while, organize a march. You have to, if there is one organized and you agree, you've got to get your body out there, because if you don't change things non-violently in this way, things will get worse. Power sticks to power. Power corrupts. And if it gets too bad, people start getting desperate and they get violent. So it's really the only way, and you really should be involved. I myself don't organize such things. I'm not a good organizer. But whenever they are organized, the more recent ones were the Iraq War and the Occupy Wall Street, I always got my body there to be counted. Because if the politicians count and they say, oh, you see, everybody else who isn't here is happy. So you do get counted if you're not there. You get counted as someone who is accepted and defends the status quo. So, yeah, I mean, I really do believe in what Socrates was doing. And he said, if you will let me go on the condition that I don't speak anymore, that I just go home and take care of my kids, I will not do that, because the God has called me to speak. And so he did resist, right? He resisted. If the jury had said that, he would have broken the decision. But he did not run away. And then the incredible irony, of course, is to kill the messenger. This is nothing new. It's a paradigm. And that's why it's a great book. The trouble is, I have a lot of colleagues in philosophy who really don't understand it. They don't understand that you need to respect the rule of law as such. And there are many people in philosophy who would think, if I were unjustly accused, I'd get out of there. I wouldn't. They don't accept Socrates' argument. And part of the argument is just for Crito, the consequentialist part. But the part that just says we're social and political beings by nature, and you have enough freedom to be reading Plato's dialogues, so you do live in a society where there is enough freedom, you shouldn't do anything that undermines it. Which means also you should be always working to make it better or to prevent making it worse. It's not a given, and you can't run away. So there's this constant civic obligation to be a conscientious citizen and to cultivate practical wisdom.